When you have cookbook on top of cookbook but don't know what to make, sometimes you go outside your comfort zone. For today's platter, we dive into not one, but two of my favorite cookbooks. The official D&D cookbook called Heroes Feast, and the other, the Final Fantasy XIV cookbook. Our D&D cookbook features a rib recipe that I've never attempted before. In fact, I've never made ribs before. I figured this was a good and perfect opportunity to try. And well, once you step into the world of ribs, we need something to go along with that, so we're going to pair it with some nice cornbread. The good thing about ribs is that you can do a lot of this prep work the morning of your session, or even the night before. We're going to start out by making our rub, which consists of some wet and dry ingredients. As with marinating any meat, the longer you can let it sit, the more tender and flavorful your ribs are going to be. I did this in the morning and popped it in the fridge for about 6 hours. Even though the ribs take about 2.5 hours to 3 hours to cook, a lot of the heavy lifting can be done ahead of time. I'll be cooking about 4 pounds of ribs, and the recipe calls for anywhere between 4 to 5 pounds. I had a good amount of sauce left over, so my guess is you won't have to modify this recipe unless you're doubling up on the ribs. Grab the ingredients listed here, and as always, I'll list them in the video description as well. Start with our ketchup and honey and mix well, and then we're going to follow up with our Worcheshire Sauce, Dijon Mustard, and a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. Once all the wet ingredients are mixed, we're going to grind out our onion to make the pieces as small as possible to help get rid of as much water before cooking. Once you're done with that, put everything to the side as we're going to work on taking the membrane off the rib. Fun stuff. While this part is definitely optional, I did explore the world of rib cooking, and a majority of the threads and info that I read did recommend removing the membrane. It won't kill you if you leave it on, but it gets chewy and gets in the way of all that tender meat, and I figured, why not give it a shot? Not to overcomplicate things, but all you need to do this is find a good piece of the membrane to cut into and work your way down one of the ribs. This will allow you to tug on either side with a paper towel and start removing the membrane in large pieces. I used a butter knife because it allowed me to get under the membrane without piercing it. Don't worry if you don't get all of it off, or if you have to go back and cut a little bit more, that's perfectly fine. Just be sure you're cutting the membrane and not taking off pieces of fat. Once you get through the rib, just start pulling slowly and steadily on one side, and then work your way on the other side. Once that's done, we can go ahead and start cooking our onion to complete the marinade. Heat up the pan on medium heat, and once warm, throw a little bit of vegetable oil on there, and add your onions to start cooking to remove any leftover water. Season onions with a little salt and pepper and let cook for about 3 to 5 minutes. We don't need to brown them, just lightly cook them. After a couple of minutes, add your garlic. Once your garlic starts to become fragrant, we can start adding our paprika, chili powder, and cayenne. I added a little bit more cayenne than the recipe called for because I wanted to make my ribs a little bit more spicier. Obviously, how little or how much you add is up to you. Once you've added the dry ingredients, give it a minute or two to cook, and then add your wet ingredients. Adjust your heat down a little bit so that everything is cooking and slightly bubbling. All we do now is cook for about 5 more minutes and let everything thicken. Once it's thick enough, which you can test by drawing a spoon across the pan, turn off your heat and let it cool for about 5 minutes. Now we're ready to marinate our ribs. Pat both sides down with a towel to get any leftover moisture left over from wrestling with the membrane, and then season both sides with salt and pepper and pat it in. At this point, all we want to do is give the ribs a good initial covering on both sides. Get your best basting brush, or if you don't want to have those, use an old paintbrush. I mean, don't really do that, but if you do, I won't judge you. Cover your ribs and pop them in the fridge. The longer the better. I gave mine about 5 hours worth of sitting time, but if the time allows, overnight will work just as well, if not better. Once you're ready to cook, and remember we want to allow for 2.5 to 3 hours of cook time, go ahead and put your ribs on a wire rack and cover your baking sheet with foil. You see here I actually upgraded my sheet because the initial one I was using was a little bit too small. I also mentioned before, I'll mention it again, this is 4 pounds of ribs. Depending on how many people you're feeding, you might need to double up on ribs, increase it to 5 pounds. With the cornbread and other sides people were bringing, this turned out to be enough, but obviously you'll want to plan accordingly for the amount of people that you are hosting. Set your oven to 325, apply another brushing of marinade, and pop the ribs in once it's ready. Make sure the ribs are meat side up, bone side down. Set a timer for 2 hours. We're going to check the ribs and apply another brushing of marinade to make sure nothing is burning. At this point, you can start on your cornbread. I should mention that the cornbread recipe in the Final Fantasy XIV cookbook was for a 10-inch cast iron pan, and I own a 12-inch pan. So, with the power of math, I had to convert the recipe to cook more. Not that more cornbread is a bad idea. In fact, it's the opposite of a bad idea. That being said, I'll do some conversions in the description to give you both the 10-inch and 12-inch options. So we'll mix all our dry ingredients here: brown sugar, cornmeal, baking powder, whole wheat, all-purpose flour, and a teaspoon of salt at the end. Once that's all mixed up, we're going to start melting our butter in a saucepan just until it becomes nice and golden brown. Sidestepping a bit while our butter was melting, I hit the 2-hour mark on our ribs. They're looking good, smelling great, and just need a little sauce to keep things happy. You can see I'm also checking the temperature in the middle of the bone, and it's about 170 degrees. Once we hit the 190 to 200 mark, we should be good to go. At this point, I'm going to set my oven timer for another 30 minutes and let it cook while I focus on the rest of the cornbread. Once your butter is melted and looking nice and golden brown, let it cool for a few minutes, and then add the honey, oil, eggs, and buttermilk, which I'm doing here. Combine the wet and dry ingredients together, mix well, and then add it to the behemoth cast iron pan. If you're like me, at this point you may have to wait for your ribs to finish before putting in the cornbread. What I did was turn the oven to 425 during the last 10 minutes of baking time for my ribs. This gives them a nice little crisp on top, and once the oven is ready at that temperature, pop in your cornbread for 20 to 25 minutes. Once your cornbread is a nice golden brown on top, you should be good to go. Once done, let your ribs cool down for a bit, and then cut them up and prepare to eat. Give them one more slather of sauce, and leave the rest out for the crew. Once your cornbread is done, you can serve directly from the cast iron or do what I did, cut up a little bit and go ahead and plate it. Your choice. As I mentioned before, the ability to do a lot of this work ahead of time makes it a surprisingly easy menu to prepare. Just manage your ribs, make sure they don't burn, and take care to prep properly. Dish was delicious, and considering it's my first time I've made either cornbread or ribs, I was really happy with how it turned out. It's summertime, perfect time for ribs, though after having these, I'd say any time is a perfect time for ribs. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know how your version turns out. I'm your DM, cook, and host, Justin. Be sure to slather that like and subscribe button with the sauciest of sauces. And may your next session be your best.